Kalen Thorne drifted in the absolute silence of the void, watching his ship's engines flare in the distance as his oxygen sensor flickered red against the blackness of space. His grip on the magnetic tether had failed when the enemy reactor detonated, throwing him into the empty dark. He was a speck of dust against the crushing weight of the stars. The stars looked different when your soul was tethered to the heart of an empire, but right now, Kalen was just a man running out of air. If you want to see if he makes it back to the airlock, join us for the rest of his journey. Now, let's look back at how a simple rescue mission turned into a fight for a throne. The coffee in his thermos had still been warm then, 6 hours before the signal went dark. It was a rhythmic, artificial pulse coming from the center of the Oort 3 asteroid belt, a place where nothing should have been alive. Kalen leaned over the navigation console of the Star Seeker, his eyes narrowing at the frequency. Beside him, Creel, the ship's veteran engineer, tapped a clawed finger against a sensor reading. The engineer's scales shifted from a dull gray to a curious copper, a sign of rising anxiety. Kalen didn't need a telepathic bond to know his friend was worried. The signal wasn't human, and it wasn't any merchant code they recognized. It was ancient, melodic, and dying. "It's a Luminaris distress ghost," Kralf muttered, his voice a gravelly rumble. "They haven't been in this sector for 3 centuries. We should keep the thrusters cold and move on, Captain." Kalen didn't move on. Instead, he adjusted his flight gloves and steered the ship deeper into the jagged graveyard of floating stone. They found it wedged between 2 massive iron core rocks. The vessel was a shimmering, organic needle of iridescent hull plating, looking more like a grown sapphire than a forged machine. Great jagged scars tore through its midsection. Below the observation deck, something shifted. A faint, violet light pulsed from within the wreckage, timed with a signal. "Prepare a boarding party," Kalen ordered. He grabbed a heavy steel-cutting torch from the equipment rack, the cold weight of the tool familiar in his palm. It was a primitive instrument compared to the elegant curves of the alien ship, but in the tight corridors of a wreck, steel and heat were more reliable than finesse. They breached the airlock with a hiss of escaping gas. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and something sweet, like crushed lilies. The corridors were lined with a biological texture that felt like hardened silk under Kalen's boots. As they moved toward the command center, the light grew stronger. Creel stopped at a junction, his sensor suite clicking rapidly. He pointed toward a sealed bulkhead at the end of the hall. Behind it, they heard a sharp, rhythmic clattering. It wasn't a machine. It was a heartbeat, frantic and loud. Kalen stepped forward, raising the cutting torch. "Wait," he whispered, sensing a presence before he saw it. The bulkhead slid open with a melodic chime, revealing a figure slumped against a pedestal of liquid light. She was silver-skinned, her blood a shimmering mercury that pooled on the floor. Her eyes, wide and violet, locked onto Kalen's. She was Hyora Xylia, and the rescue had just become a war. The violet glow from Xylia's skin pulsed in time with the proximity alarms. Outside the crystalline hull, 3 obsidian black pursuit ships tore through the debris field, their plasma cannons turning wandering asteroids into molten slag. Kalen didn't hesitate. He scooped the injured princess into his arms, her weight surprisingly light, as if she were made of hollow bone and starlight. "Go, back to the Seeker," Kalen roared over the sound of crumbling bulkheads. They sprinted through the organic ship as it groaned under the assault. Kralf took the lead, his heavy pulse rifle clearing a path through the automated internal defenses that had begun to malfunction. How did a species so advanced end up so fragile in the face of raw aggression? It was the classic paradox of the Luminaris. Their technology was built on harmony and psychic resonance, leaving them nearly defenseless against the jagged, chaotic violence of a kinetic energy civilization. Would you have risked your entire crew for a stranger from the stars? Let me know in the comments if Kalen made the right call. We're heading into the final stretch now. Back on the Star Seeker, the situation was worse. The pursuit ships had them pinned. Kalen looked at the steel-cutting torch still gripped in his hand. then at the enemy vessel looming over their bow. "I'm going out," Kalen said, his voice flat. He didn't wait for Krail's protest. He jammed himself into the emergency airlock, tethered his suit, and launched into the black. He drifted, a speck of dust, until he reached the enemy's primary thruster array. With a roar of effort, he jammed the steel torch into the fuel injection manifold and triggered the igniter. The explosion was a silent, blinding bloom of white. The shock waves snapped his tether like a dry twig. And now Kalen drifted in the absolute silence of the void. He watched his ship's engines flare in the distance, a retreating spark of warmth, while his oxygen sensor flickered red against the blackness of space. He was ready to let go. He closed his eyes, the cold finally reaching his marrow. Then, a heat like 1,000 suns erupted in his chest. Zilia reached out from the medbay of the Starseeker, her mind screaming across the vacuum. She initiated the soul tether, a forbidden psychic bridge that stitched his fading heartbeat to her own royal lineage. Kalen's eyes snapped open. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a living extension of the Luminaris crown. Months later, on the golden spires of Aethelgard, Kalen stood before the matriarch Valeriana. He had survived the trials and the steel-toothed shadow of Lord Drav's assassins. He was no longer the captain of a scavenger ship, but a bridge between two worlds that had spent centuries fearing one another. In the center of the royal palace, mounted upon a pedestal of pure white marble, sat a scorched, primitive steel-cutting torch. It was a jagged reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated empires are saved by the simplest, sharpest resolve. Kalen looked at the tool, then at the stars, and finally felt at home. How much of yourself would you be willing to lose to become something greater? We'll be exploring more legends of the deep void soon, so make sure to return for the next chronicle.